Hey, everybody. So I want to talk about Egypt, and we're going to talk about Egypt by starting with a headline from just a couple days ago. So let's just get right to it, and we'll get into what we're talking about. Exclusive: Egypt hesitates over joining Saudi-led maritime coalition in the Red Sea. So before I read the article, this is published on August 4th. Saudi Arabia formally announced a 14-country coalition to protect shipping in the Red Sea. Turkey signed on, Pakistan signed on, Qatar and Jordan signed on, and Egypt, the country that arguably has the most to lose if the Red Sea shipping is disrupted, is the one that is hanging back and is hesitant about signing on. So let's take a look at this story. And then what we're going to do in the rest of this video is we're going to talk about the Egyptian situation ever since October 7th, and with all of these conflicts going on, how it's affected them, and try to understand their behavior. So let's take a look. Egypt expressed reservations about joining the multinational maritime coalition announced by Saudi Arabia, despite intensive Saudi efforts to persuade Cairo, according to an informed Egyptian source who told the New Arab. The source said that officials from the two countries, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, held talks in recent days to discuss the nature of the coalition, the objectives, and the mechanisms for participation. However, Cairo informed the Saudis that it will not participate in military operations beyond its borders unless they are directly linked to its national security. Before we go on, let me show you where Egypt is on the map. Let's take a look. Here we are. Here's Egypt on the map. Okay, and this is a pretty simple one to understand. Here is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down here. This is where the Houthis are disrupting shipping. And here's Saudi Arabia, and here's Egypt right here. And Egypt has the Suez Canal that passes through here. Right here is the Suez Canal, so that means that shipping can come up the Red Sea and out to the Mediterranean to Europe. And what this means in terms of energy is that the Saudi East-West pipeline, which comes out at Yanbu right here, can ship crude oil up through the Suez Canal to Europe, or down and out to the east. So this is a major shipping lane here. Let's get back to this. So you see, it's obvious on the map why what's happening in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, why what's happening in the Middle East has such an effect on Egypt. Let's get back to it. The source said that Egypt's position is based on, quote, a well-established doctrine, end quote, of foreign policy to avoid being entangled in external military coalitions or operations that could expand the scope of conflict in the region. In other words, Saudi Arabia comes to Egypt and says, hey, we're putting together a coalition to stop all this Houthi nonsense in Bab el-Mandeb so we can have clear shipping through the Red Sea. You stand to lose more than pretty much anybody. Join the coalition. Whole bunch of other countries in the area joined: Turkey, Qatar, others, Jordan. And Egypt says, no. We have a long-standing, a well-established doctrine. We don't get involved in any conflict in the region. Okay, the source further said Cairo seeks political and diplomatic solutions, particularly given the current regional complexities, because Egyptian authorities have channels of communication and relations with all key parties involved in the regional conflict. We're on all sides, say the Egyptians. The source further said Cairo seeks political and diplomatic solutions, particularly given the, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I already read this. Good. The state-owned and state-affiliated media outlets in Egypt on Monday, this is a couple days ago, citing an informed source, reported that Egypt's participation in a multinational maritime coalition aimed at protecting navigation through maritime routes and securing global trade is still being studied as part of a review of all relevant legal and constitutional aspects. We're looking into it. The source added that this current assessment is considering all legal and constitutional dimensions to ensure that any further step complies with the Egyptian constitution and laws, safeguards national interests, and fulfills the relevant institutional obligations. For his part, former Assistant Foreign Minister Ambassador Massoum Marzouk said to the New Arab that while the idea of a regional security coalition is strategically sound, the coalition requires greater clarity regarding its objectives, the risks it seeks to address, and the specific roles of each participating state. We want to learn more about this idea. Hello, it's to open the Bab el-Mandeb Strait so you can have shipping through the Suez Canal. It's very strange. Why is Egypt hesitating on this? Remember, the other parties involved here, it's not like they're, they're so friendly to the West, meaning that Egypt, might be afraid of joining, like the more moderate Abraham Accords type countries, even though they already have peace with Israel. They don't want to be fighting the Houthis. They're going in with the Turks and the Qataris and the Saudis. What are they afraid of? Marzouk, who previously served as an officer in the Egyptian armed forces, also said he had repeatedly called in his writings for the establishment of he had repeatedly called in his writings for the establishment of a regional security system in the Middle East to confront the threats posed by the Israeli entity as a present and future threat to all countries in the region, not only the Arab states. What on earth that has to do with opening the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, I do not know. He argued Cairo's presence within the framework would enable it to reshape its balance and understand its mechanisms, given Egypt's position as an active, influential regional player. The Egyptian position comes as the region experiences growing security tensions, with continuing concerns over the expansion of maritime confrontations and their impact on global trade and shipping routes through the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb. There are also concerns about the direct repercussions for the Egyptian economy and Suez Canal revenues. We'll get into that in detail very soon. In recent years, Cairo has pursued a foreign policy based on avoiding direct military involvement in regional crises. That's correct. Egypt always sits it out, while focusing on diplomatic tools and strengthening mediation roles in several files, including Gaza, Libya, and Sudan. At the same time, it has sought to maintain balanced relations with different regional powers. In other words, Egypt always tries to play all sides of every conflict. That's what that paragraph means. Observers believe the Egyptian reservations also reflect Cairo's desire to avoid being drawn into open conflicts amid a highly complex regional environment, particularly as regional polarization continues and international interests overlap in the Red Sea and strategic waterways. The position also reflects Cairo's determination to distinguish between its commitment to security in the Red Sea, which represents a direct strategic interest, and participation in combat-oriented coalitions that could widen the scope of the brewing regional war. Last Thursday, the Saudi Ministry of Defense announced that 14 countries, including Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, and Jordan, had issued a joint statement supporting a proposal to establish a multinational defensive maritime coalition aimed at enhancing maritime security and protecting international sea lanes. In a statement, the ministry said the kingdom hosted a meeting attended by chiefs of staff, representatives of sisterly and friendly countries, and the delegation of the European Union to the kingdom to discuss the kingdom's initiative to establish the multinational defensive maritime coalition as part of efforts to enhance maritime security, protect international sea lanes, and address threats targeting maritime navigation and global trade. And this was translated from the original Arabic. So they were part of the original discussions, but now they're hesitating on whether or not to join the coalition. Okay, that's where we are on that. Now we can take this story off the stage and let's just talk about what we saw here. So that's the story as reported. An Egyptian source telling a reporter on the record, but not by name, that Cairo won't send its military into operations beyond its own borders unless those operations are directly tied to Egypt's own national security, and that officials are actively weighing what this could do to Suez Canal revenue before committing to anything. Now, if you've watched this channel before, you know that there's always a tell of what's actually going on, a pattern. And I think with Egypt, it has to do with their very tenuous economic situation. I made a video a couple of days ago, really yesterday, I made a video about the Turkish economy and how it impacts the Turkish geopolitical position and behavior. We're going to kind of do the same thing with Egypt for the rest of this video, okay? Egypt's a different case than Turkey, and I think the numbers will explain why. So first of all, if we look on the map again, we see that Egypt has a border with the Gaza Strip. That's obvious, right? Egypt has that border. And once when you take that into account, when you take into account the border that Egypt has with Gaza, you know that Egypt is kind of walking on eggshells with everything going on, over there in the Gaza Strip. And Egypt also has a border, of course, with Sudan. And Sudan has had this massive civil war going on, and there are Iranian-backed militias in this area as well. So there's a lot of things surrounding Egypt that complicate matters for it. But let's, I digress a little bit. So Egypt shares the border with Gaza. It controls the Rafah crossing, the border crossing into Gaza. And it's also been serving the role of mediator. A lot of the negotiations and the mediation efforts about what to do next with Gaza are taking place there. And yet, compared to the rhetoric, the anti-Israel rhetoric that you hear coming out of Turkey, or certainly coming out of the Iranian regime, Egypt has been kind of restrained, kind of careful, very vague, seeming to play all sides at once, rather committing hard to one of the sides, which is exactly what we just saw in this piece about this Red Sea coalition. So the question I want to ask today is the same one we asked about Turkey yesterday. What does the economy of Egypt, what's the story of the economy of Egypt, and what does it tell us about their behavior? So let's start with the same measure we used for Turkey yesterday, and that is Hankey's Misery Index. To remind you, if you didn't see the video about Turkey, go to the channel. After you watch this video, or maybe even pause this video now and then come back to it, but make sure that you watch the video about Turkey. It's one of the most recent videos on this channel. And we talked about the Misery Index. The Misery Index, it sounds like a silly name or like a sort of junk stat, but it's actually a real economic indicator. And what it is it combines inflation rate and unemployment rate and like lending rates, and it's all combined into a score. And it's a reflection. He calls it the Misery Index because it's a reflection of how bad things are for the citizen, for the person living there, because of high unemployment, high inflation. Those are the key drivers. And he ranked 178 countries from worst to best in 2025. Turkey was third on the list, and that was a big, again, go back and watch that video. And that might shock you to hear that if you didn't watch yesterday's video, that Turkey is the third worst on the list. One of the worst. Egypt's nowhere near that bad. It ranks 26th most miserable. Now that's still really, really bad. Okay, understand. We're talking about 178 countries. That puts Egypt in the bottom, 15% or so, approximately. That's pretty bad. So that's real economic pain, but it's not the kind of collapse Turkey's dealing with. But here's an important detail. A big difference between Turkey and Egypt. Turkey's score, as we saw yesterday, was mainly driven by its lending rate, right? It's borrowing money at a tremendous rate. And because the central bank of Turkey, what Turkey's going through right now is that the central bank is fighting hard to keep its currency from crashing. So it's taking all sorts of artificial measures. And Egypt's misery score is driven mainly by the unemployment number. And so these two countries are they're both experiencing economic crisis, but they're not exactly the same. Again, Turkey's problem is its currency. Egypt mainly, it's unemployment also, but the currency is the bigger problem. Egypt's central problem right now is massive unemployment. That said, Egypt has its own currency and debt problems. They're just not the biggest single driver of their misery score. Now let's go to October 7th, or let's go to before October 7th, because what we're looking at is what is the impact of all of this war from October 7th till today, all of the things that's happened, what impact have they had on Egypt's economy? So before October 7th, Egypt's economy was already in big trouble. Before the Hamas attack, Egypt was in the middle of its own domestic financial crisis, unrelated to Israel, Gaza. Inflation had already climbed past 32% by early 2023. 32% inflation. That means, just in case you don't know, that means that on that date, a year earlier to then, there's prices rise by a third on everything. Okay, foreign debt had already passed $160 billion. Egypt was short on foreign currency. And the government devalued the Egyptian pound by more than a third, cutting its value deliberately. And that was because of a new loan agreement with the International Monetary Fund. Okay, this might be getting a little in the weeds. Pause, take a deep breath. I will explain. The International Monetary Fund pushed for Egypt to devalue its currency because Egypt had been artificially propping up its currency, while there was also a black market rate for the currency that reflected more its real value. And so there was this gap between the black market rate for Egyptian pounds and what the official value of it was that was being propped up by government action. And that scared off foreign investors, and it encouraged people to hold dollars instead of Egyptian pounds. By devaluing their own currency, they closed the gap between the fake propped up value and the real value, and that made Egyptian exports cheaper and more competitive abroad, and that gave lenders a sense that the government was finally willing to let the currency reflect its real value. Okay, if this is getting a little into the weeds, just bear with me. It'll all make sense. I'm going to explain everything. Meaning, if you saw the Turkey video, what Turkey's central bank has been doing, spending all their foreign currency reserves, billions and billions of dollars, and selling off, tons of gold in order to prop up the currency artificially. That's what Egypt kind of was doing. And as we saw with the Turkey video, that approach can work for a while, but it's not sustainable. Egypt chose to devalue its currency on its own in a deliberate move rather than artificially propping it up, so to allow the International Monetary Fund to lend it more money. This is all happening before the Gaza war started, before October 7th. So then comes October 7th, the Gaza war begins, and this adds a new shock to Egypt's economy that was already weak. So what happened to Egypt's economy once the war started? Three things mainly. If you were lost a little bit in the previous points, let's refocus here. I'm going to go through three major shocks to Egypt's economy, major blows to Egypt's economy that happened since October 7th. First is the Suez Canal. So I talked a few minutes ago about how the Suez Canal is huge for Egypt. It's a shipping lane, but it's also a massive, massive piece of Egypt's economy. The Egyptian government charges every ship that transits the Suez Canal a toll. You're allowed to charge tolls in a man-made canal. The Panama Canal also charges tolls. A man-made waterway is not an international waterway. You can charge tolls. Okay, so the Egyptian government charges tolls through the Suez Canal. That toll revenue brought in about $10.2 billion in 2023, making it one of Egypt's largest sources of foreign currency. Okay, it's a big piece of the Egyptian economy. Once the Houthis started attacking Red Sea shipping shortly after, after the war began, after October 7th, the Houthis were showing solidarity with Hamas, and they were disrupting shipping in Bab el-Mandeb. Insurers and shipping companies lost confidence in that route for obvious reasons, and they started routing vessels around the southern tip of Africa instead. A much longer and more expensive route, but much safer. By 2024, Suez Canal revenue had fallen from 10.2 billion to 4 billion. Okay, that's a 61% drop in one of Egypt's most reliable sources of foreign currency in a single year. President Sisi has put Egypt's total accumulated losses from the disruption of Suez at around 10 billion, about 500 billion Egyptian pounds, and he described it as a direct hit to the state's economic capacity. Sorry, just had to cough. Okay, let's put the shipping disruption in perspective now. At the start of 2023, around 12% of the world's oil shipments were passing through the Suez Canal. 12%. By 2025, that number was cut by more than half to about 5%. Okay, so you put it all together, massive loss in revenue from the Suez Canal. So that's the first thing that happened to Egypt as a result of the war after October 7th. The second hit to their economy was tourism and gas. We'll put those together. Tourism is another huge source of foreign currency for Egypt. Egypt is Egypt, with the pyramids and it's a massive tourist destination, and tourists cancel or rebook trips really quickly. So tourism can vanish in a flash when there's any instability around. So Egypt also imports natural gas from Israel. Israel provides a lot of Egypt's fuel needs. And this arrangement becomes a lot harder to maintain when Israel's fighting a war in the region. So the tourism revenue and the gas supply were both disrupted in the war's early months, at a time when Egypt had very little wiggle room to absorb these losses. So you got the Suez Canal hit, got the tourism dries up, and then you have disruptions in Israel providing natural gas for a variety of reasons. The third hit that they took was the debt and the currency situation. That's why I put gas and tourism together. They're easy to talk about. The same kind of numbers we looked at for Turkey. It's just structured a little bit differently. Okay, so Egypt's external debt is about $169 billion. That's how much money they owe to other countries. Okay, that's about 40% of their GDP. Now, on its own, that's not an alarming ratio of debt to GDP. Plenty of stable economies carry more than that. But the question is, how much cash flow do you have to pay, right? And what kind of debt it is. This is external debt owed in dollars and other foreign currencies. It's not in Egyptian pounds. Remember what we talked about the Turkish currency falling. If your Egyptian pound is losing value, then your debt is basically expanding, because the currency that your own currency is just worth less. So without doing anything, your debt is rising. So a government that owes money in its own currency, in a pinch, you can print more of it or lean on domestic banks to help cover the bill. Egypt doesn't have that option. It has to earn or borrow actual dollars to pay this money. Or they could buy dollars, but that would just make it even worse in terms of their currency. Okay, and that's why the Suez Canal and tourism, okay, are huge. Because that's foreign currency coming into their economy. So when the dollar inflows dry up, as they did after October 7th, that debt load of 40% of GDP, which looked manageable, got a lot harder to service. So debt payments due in 2026 alone are close to $29 billion. Egypt's foreign currency reserves are around $53 billion. And that only covers about 5 months of the country's imports. The Egyptian pound has lost 70% of its value since 2022 through a series of devaluations. It's expected to keep losing value this year, through the rest of this year. And that's because it's now free floating, meaning the International Monetary Fund is not allowing Egypt to prop it up anymore. Anyway, so that's what's happening to Egypt. Now, on top of all of this, on top of all of these economic problems that I just laid out, Egypt also has absorbed somewhere around 1.2 million refugees from Sudan's civil war since 2023. That's right. While they have the border closed, not allowing anyone in from Gaza, around 1.2 million new arrivals from Sudan, from that civil war, have come into Egypt. So that has caused a refugee problem, a housing cost shock. And Egypt was already dealing with a problem from the Ukraine war. Now, why would Egypt be dealing with a problem from the Ukraine war? Well, Egypt imports about 70% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And wheat prices from Russia and Ukraine spiked like crazy when that war happened. So here's what you got. You have Egypt, that the economy was already not on the firmest foundation, wasn't doing so well. And then they have the Gaza thing. You have the Sudanese civil war. And you have the Ukraine situation, 3 separate wars that all hit the Egyptian economy in roughly the same time period. Are you with me? Let's stay focused. We're almost done here. Now, a rapid assessment from the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, tried to model just the Gaza war piece of this in isolation. Okay, and they ran like this study, like this projection, and in their medium scenario, Egypt's GDP came out about 2.6% below where it otherwise would have been if not for the Gaza war. Right, unemployment is projected to climb from 7.8% to 9%. So they have real drags on their economy here. And now, and that's all before, I haven't even mentioned the Iran war. I'm talking about October 7th, Gaza, all that, Ukraine and Sudan, all putting pressure on the Egyptian economy, which brings us to 2026. Egypt had not recovered from these things. And then the US-Israel strikes on Iran in 2026 added a new shock to the system. The oil price spikes. There's more shipping disruptions. Okay, and that puts even more pressure on Egypt. Now, Egypt's been borrowing money from the IMF for a long time, and they also received this big loan or investment package from the UAE in early 2024, which was really a lifeline to them. Now, inflation was coming down a little bit. The currency, like I said, is floating freely, but Egypt is still the 5th largest borrower in the world in terms of borrowing money from the International Monetary Fund. And that is not a sustainable situation, okay? Because their revenues are so far down, they can't repay these loans, they're just borrowing more money. Now let's connect this into the geopolitics. That's the whole point of this video. With Turkey, we made the following argument, that the anti-Israel rhetoric is cheap, it's free, and Erdogan can talk tough on Israel because it doesn't cost his government anything financially, while actual military involvement would severely damage his economy. And that's why in that video, I kind of said, like, with all of the worry about the rise of Turkey, we have to kind of take a deep breath and realize that they're not about to take any military action. They can't really afford it. Egypt's situation is actually very different because Egypt physically borders Gaza. They officially have a peace treaty with Israel. They can't, they're trying to play this kind of mediator role. They need to have good relationships with Israel because they also buy Israeli natural gas in large quantities. So they have to be, they can't just spew anti-Israel rhetoric as a way of, and saber rattling against Israel. They can't just do that. So they have to manage, and they also are terrified of Palestinians from Gaza pouring over the border into Egypt. Now, Egypt's revenue depends on the Suez Canal running smoothly, on tourists continuing to book trips, and the International Monetary Fund and Gulf governments continuing to view Cairo as reliable. That's the picture I'm painting here. So Egypt can't afford instability on its doorstep. And so the options that we might want them to take, the actions that might seem to make sense, I should say, politically, like opening the border to Gazan refugees, or something that might make sense, like maybe they could take I wouldn't suggest this, but I'm saying you might think that, hey, why don't they just take go the Erdogan route and start taking a harsh line against Israel, and deflect attention from their collapsing economy to that, but it would cost them way too much. Those are not moves that Egypt can take. So the combination of pressures is why Egypt is in this kind of, they're always playing all sides. They're always like the mediator. They don't want to be confrontational. They want to stay relevant in the diplomatic process, and show the International Monetary Fund and the Gulf states that they're reliable and stable. But they also want to keep the Suez Canal open, and they don't want to commit their already strained economy to a conflict that they can't afford to be part of. So that's the That's the state of play here. So if you're trying to predict Egyptian behavior over the next year, how are they going to continue to behave vis-a-vis Israel? As factions develop within the various Arab countries, Muslim countries, who are they going to get closest to? If we're trying to predict it, what we're looking at is an economy that has very little room for risk. Which brings us all the way back to the story that we started this video with, the Red Sea coalition that Saudi Arabia is putting together. Egypt hesitating, while Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, Jordan are signed on. What's Egypt doing? So joining a multinational military coalition on the Red Sea means that Egypt is now a participant in whatever comes next out there, right? They're no longer neutral. And the moment that Egypt looks like a participant instead of a neutral party, every ship that might otherwise choose the Suez Canal has to think twice. Because there's not no shipping going through the Suez Canal, but if Egypt's involved in a war and the Houthis start firing missiles at Egypt, because Egypt's right nearby, the other countries in this coalition, Pakistan, Qatar, Turkey, are not as close. Jordan's close, but Jordan doesn't stand as much to lose. Jordan also has U.S. bases where it is and has U.S. air defenses there. Egypt has to think twice, right? The Suez Canal's already lost 61% of its revenue, and Egypt wasn't even in that war. So Egypt has every financial incentive to stay out of anything that could make that even worse. So what I'm looking for going forward is more of this same pattern of Egypt trying to dance between the raindrops, and they're studying the coalition, but they're not joining the coalition. And they put out a statement in support of the Saudi coalition, but they're not committing any troops to the coalition. And they're offering to mediate, and they don't want to send military support. This is just the way they're behaving, and it's almost the only thing they can do here. So that's the Egyptian picture as I see it. Look, they are what they are. We have a peace treaty with them, but it's not really peace. It's really just hush money to keep them in some level of behaving themselves. There's a lot more to say about Egypt. I've made a number of videos in the past over the last few years on the Israel 365 news channel about Egypt, but I thought it was important to get back to this topic now and address it. Okay, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video. Make sure you like, subscribe, all that. Let me know what you thought of this. I hope it made sense. If you have questions, put them in the comments, and I'll try to address them as well.